All right, hello everyone. This week we're going to talk about the conservation officer's law enforcement function and their patrol strategies. The law enforcement function, like for most officers, is the most widely recognized and most closely associated function with conservation law enforcement. The law enforcement function of conservation officers is more than simply just enforcing the law. The function of conservation officers is critical to the management of natural resources. So there's three pillars to natural resources management in the United States: research, management, and law enforcement. If any of those three pillars didn't exist or was ineffective, then you can't really properly manage natural resources. So much of the law enforcement methods and techniques utilized by conservation officers are similar to those of traditional police officers. However, of course, the context in which they do those is often quite different. So, like regular police, the law enforcement role of conservation officers has evolved over time, and really, there's kind of a couple of main events in recent history that have evolved the law enforcement role of conservation officers. The first was this evolution of departments of natural resources in the 1990s. Prior to this, there were lots of different natural resources agencies, and there were already departments of natural resources, but they were all smaller. And you had some of these smaller departments of conservation. But then in the 90s, a lot of these smaller departments started kind of morphing into or were absorbed into these larger departments of natural resources. And within these departments of natural resources, you had, it was kind of this melding of all these different kinds of divisions into one larger department. So as they were absorbed in these larger agencies, conservation officers also began to change, and they started more resembling a general service, more of a general service type police agency. Another thing that happened over the years is more and more people from urban areas have begun recreating in rural areas. A lot of that due to urban sprawl and things like that. Places where, people used to live in rural areas and now they don't. And, so more and more people are recreating in rural areas, especially during COVID times. But just kind of over time, this is something that's happened. Well, as you increase people from urban areas coming to rural areas, they bring urban crime issues with them. So because conservation officers are the ones that are likely to interact with these people coming from the urban areas, out of necessity, they've begun to deal with more of what's considered to be, more of your traditional urban type crimes. All right, so a little bit of background here. So traditionally, and then today, conservation officers are tasked, mainly with enforcing hunting and fishing regulations and other natural resources related laws. Like that really hasn't changed. That's still their main focus. And you're talking about approximately 6,000 conservation officers in the United States. Okay, about. And that sounds like quite a few. But for comparison, in 2021, there were about 660,000 full-time law enforcement officers in the U.S. 660,000. So even if that number accounts for those 6,000 conservation officers, you're still looking at about 650,000-ish full-time police officers. Okay, so the number of conservation officers within the larger law enforcement community, is quite small. And if you think about what they need to do, right, they're enforcing hunting and fishing regulations. So if you look at the number of hunters outnumber conservation officers approximately 10,000 to 1. And that's only hunters. That doesn't include all the other various types of outdoor recreationists, that a conservation officer may encounter. Anglers, bird watchers, campers, now there's some crossover obviously between those things, but that 10,000 to 1 is strictly just hunters. So if you think about the law enforcement function of conservation officers, they have a pretty tall task in front of them regarding the enforcement of hunting, fishing, and other natural resources laws and regulations. So because of these vast odds facing conservation officers, obviously they're not going to catch everybody, right? So the key word that really kind of encompasses most of what conservation officers are trying to accomplish, regarding law enforcement is compliance. Okay, so these various types of strategies to help with compliance in addition to law enforcement, like education, public relations, things like that. And we'll talk more about those next week. So if you think about this kind of concept of compliance, it's very similar to traffic enforcement. Okay, the goal of traffic enforcement is to get people to comply with traffic laws, right? So if people comply with traffic laws, then everything works better. Okay, so it's kind of the same thing, kind of generally kind of the same kind of concept of compliance. Okay, another challenge facing conservation officers when you think about their law enforcement duties is the context within which they encounter most of the people that they're interacting with in this law enforcement capacity. Okay, most of the people they encounter are recreating, in the outdoors, whether that's hunting, fishing, floating, boating, bird watching, right? And think about that compared to traditional police officers. That's a very different context than what traditional police officers generally encounter people. So because of this, and other officers do this too, but conservation officers utilize hard and soft enforcement. Okay, so hard enforcement is really the type of enforcement that most people associate with law enforcement, including conservation. So hard enforcement is, this real formal method using punitive sanctions such as ticketing, arrest, to gain compliance. All right. So, but the type of enforcement that's not as readily recognized is soft enforcement. Okay. So soft enforcement is gaining compliance through more informal methods, such as education, prevention, community relations. Okay. And soft enforcement can be both proactive and reactive. So there's really kind of 4 types of soft enforcement that they've identified. There's conciliatory, there's threat, non-enforcement, and covert. So conciliatory enforcement is pretty much known as like encouraging compliance, and the goal is to gain compliance while the user continues to enjoy their day. Okay, so you're doing stuff like just talking to people, maybe sitting there in your car, your marked patrol vehicle, those types of things. Getting people to comply with rules, but not really like, real kind of hardcore about it. Okay, threat enforcement is kind of the next level, right? Threat enforcement utilizes the threat or promise of formal enforcement action if the person doesn't begin to comply. So unlike conciliatory enforcement, threat enforcement doesn't care whether or not that person's enjoying their day, right? They're doing something wrong, and you better get it straight or there's going to be some kind of consequences. All right, non-enforcement, that's the next type, and that's simply what it says, right? The officer doesn't do anything. And there's different reasons why officers may choose to not enforce things, but non-enforcement is always an option when you're a law enforcement officer. And then the final method is what they call covert enforcement. Now, they use covert enforcement to mean several different things in the law enforcement realm, but in soft enforcement covert, this is where, so they don't worry about the user's enjoyment, and this may be something like seizing tents that are in a prohibited area and leaving a note. They have to go to the main office to retrieve their belongings, right? That sort of thing. Where it's not any kind of direct confrontation, it's, what they consider to be covert, like seizing somebody's tents and being like, hey, you got to go to the office. And then when you go to the office, they're like, hey, look, you're in the wrong place. Either need to get it together or you need to leave, right? Or if you go back there, you're going to get a ticket, that sort of thing. So soft enforcement allows for more discretionary decision-making by the officer, but over time, it loses its effectiveness if there's no follow-up or no at least threat of follow-up with some type of hard enforcement. So if you're talking about discretion, though, and you think about a hard enforcement situation, well, the discretion for a hard enforcement situation would then be soft enforcement, right? Some kind of warning, some kind of something like that, as opposed to punitive sanctions. All right, so how do they go about the business of detecting law violations? What do they do? Well, there's 3 kind of main overarching law enforcement strategies that conservation officers will utilize. And municipal police officers utilize these same strategies, but again, different context, right? So the first is community policing. And once again, community policing is a buzzword in the policing world. Okay, it was a buzzword in the 80s and 90s, and that kind of fell out of favor a little bit, or just maybe not out of favor, but just wasn't as popular, and now we're back again with community policing. So one of the issues with community policing is there's just been this struggle as to figure out like what is it, how do we do it, especially in municipal and urban police departments. But conservation officers have been utilizing community policing for years, right? Even before like it really had a name kind of thing. And mostly out of necessity, right? So if you think about conservation officers, you have one officer in a county, right? Well, how do they do their job? Well, they have to work with the community, right? They have to interact with the community. So they've been doing community policing for a long time. So community policing kind of its most broad. The strategy that says that officers have to work closely with the community, both residents and businesses, instead of just relying on themselves for crime control. So in community policing, crime prevention is the key rather than strict enforcement. Okay, so the focus of community policing is on the how of policing. How are we doing this? And remember that, because we talk about the other ones, we'll talk about how they compare. So there's 4 dimensions of community policing. I don't have time to go into each of those. This video is going to be pretty long the way it is. But make sure you understand each of those different dimensions to community policing. All right, second strategy we're going to talk about is problem-oriented policing. Now the basic idea here is that police identify, understand, and address the various issues that result in citizens calling the police. So this strategy often sounds very similar to community policing, but is different in the focus. Okay, so we said in community policing the focus was on the how, while in problem-oriented policing the focus is on the what. What is the end result of what we are doing? Okay, both may utilize community contact, but the focus of the strategies is different. So the process through which agencies use problem-oriented policing is the CRM model, which stands for Scanning, Analysis, Response, and Assessment. Again, understand what each of those are and what that would look like in a conservation law enforcement scenario. All right, so the third main strategy is hotspots policing. So hotspots policing means that crime is not evenly distributed across an area. Okay, if you think about a city, think about anything, right? Crime is not evenly distributed all the way across that area. There are hotspots within that city or within that jurisdiction where crime occurs at a much greater rate than in the remainder of the rest of the area. So this strategy says that police/conservation officers should focus on those areas because that's where crime's actually occurring, instead of just trying to spread their efforts evenly across an area, even though no or really less crime is occurring there. Okay, so think about what that strategy would look like in a conservation type of situation. All right, so in addition to these kind of overarching strategies, conservation officers also use a variety of patrol and investigative methods. Okay, and I'm not going to go into great detail on these because, again, this video is getting pretty long, but make sure you understand these different things and what they look like. So, like regular police, conservation officers participate in routine patrol, right? That's similar to just patrolling by a municipal police officer. So they drive around, they're assigned jurisdiction, normally in their patrol vehicle, which would be a 4-wheel drive truck or an SUV, just looking for crimes that are occurring, or to kind of give this air of I'm always present, right? I'm always out on the lookout. So know kind of the characteristics of what routine patrol is. Conservation officers also will patrol using boats, on horseback, and using aircraft. Okay, patrolling by boats is pretty similar to routine patrol, except you're obviously patrolling for stuff that would happen on the water. Okay, horseback used to be very, very common. It's not nearly as common anymore, but still used to some extent in the western states, places where it's real rugged, places where you still can't get, a four-wheeler or some kind of all-terrain vehicle in there. They'll still use horses in some of those places. They use aircraft. There's a variety of capacities in which they use aircraft. They use them sometimes to look for night hunters, where the aircraft will fly and they'll look for spotlights working, and then they'll send in ground units to wherever those lights are. They can also use them to do things like find illegally baited fields, illegally baited blinds, use them in search and rescue. There's a lot of different capacities in which conservation officers may use aircraft. They use canines. Some use what you consider traditional police canines, like Belgian Malinois and German Shepherds. But they also use a lot of like Labrador Retrievers and other retrieving breeds or hunting breeds to assist with finding hidden wildlife. They use a lot of them in in international trafficking kind of situations. They're trained to smell contraband. So a lot of the same reasons why traditional police would use canines, conservation officers use canines, but there's a real focus on being able to find hidden wildlife, find spent gun casings, those sorts of things. Conservation officers also use undercover and covert operations. Now this is different than the soft enforcement covert. This is a traditional kind of law enforcement covert operation. In a conservation context, these are oftentimes used to target illegal commercial operations or large-scale poaching operations, things that a regular conservation officer would not have the capacity to be able to investigate. Same kinds of risks, in these type of operations that you'd have in like an undercover drug operation. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is very involved in these kind of investigations, so know about the role of those. One of the newest, one of the kind of more common are computer investigations. There's a lot of illegal wildlife and natural resources activity that goes on online. There's all kinds of different marketplaces where things are bought and sold. The focus of the literature and the news is always these large international smuggling rings that are operating online. But many conservation officers make cases locally by watching local classified ads websites. It's interesting. So it's been a long time since I was a conservation agent. I worked from 1999 to 2008. So toward the end of my career, Craigslist was just kind of getting going, and some eBay and like some of these these online marketplaces were just kind of getting going. And there were several officers that kind of went to administration, was like, hey, we need to be able to look at these things, because they had our internet locked down. Like you couldn't look at anything that wasn't what they considered to be 100% work related. So they asked for permission to look at these websites, and they were like, no, you don't have to look at any of that stuff. There's nothing going on there. You just want to shop or whatever. Well, now that's gone, completely the opposite direction, to where, there's officers now that's their job, is just to literally look at these different classified ads websites and look for illegal wildlife trade and stuff like that on there. So this has really evolved, over time, with how much, all the social media stuff and the computer stuff and internet, like how all that stuff has evolved. This has evolved along with it. And then finally, the last one we're going to talk about is forensics. Forensic analysis has come a long way, and it's used, of course, in wildlife law enforcement. The Clark-Baven National Fish and Wildlife Laboratory was founded in 1989. And now there's an additional 11 other states that have forensic labs. And then NOAA has a marine animal lab. There's a lot of uses for forensics. Blood, hair, DNA, shell casings, paint, wildlife parts. So interesting. I'll tell you a quick interesting story like this. So there's a part of Missouri where there's a herd of wild horses. And it was in the county next to where I was an agent. And someone killed a couple of those horses during deer season one year. And they're on federal property. So we had a huge meeting we got to figure out who did this. And we thought we knew who had done it. But of course, known and proven, of course, are two different things. So they ended up finding some paint on a tree where the truck that they were driving had scraped against tree bark and left a little bit of paint on the tree. So they were able to collect that paint. They sent it to the Clark-Baven National Fish and Wildlife Laboratory. And then they got a search warrant for who we thought it was. And of course, they had a truck of the same color. And they were able to match that paint to the paint on the truck. And we were able to make a case for them killing those wild horses. So forensic analysis is really, it's a pretty important part of wildlife law enforcement anymore. All right, I'm going to end here for today. I've gone on for quite a while. So I'm always interested in whether or not students are watching my videos all the way to the end. So if you're still watching, email me the phrase "watched it," and I will add 2 points to your score on this week's assignment. All right, so be sure to complete those assignments. Let me know if you have questions, and I'll see you next week.